So this is the end. I regret to inform you that Dungeons and Dragons is over, and it's all the fault of Matt Colville and Matt Mercer. They have killed the Dungeons and Dragons golden age, and this might come as a surprise to you. I mean, it seems pretty clear to anyone that Dungeons and Dragons has never been bigger. There's never been more people interested in playing it, and there's never been better games in the role-playing game hobby. And many people assumed, myself included, that this would just continue on forever and ever, trending upwards like the glorious and eternal Mayan Empire. Alas, unfortunately, apparently the Mayan Empire ended, and so will now Dungeons and Dragons too. Damn you, Matt Mercer! Is there anything you haven't killed? That's not an allegation, by the way. Do not come after me, Matt Mercer, please. So please like the video, subscribe to the channel for the final time, because I'm gonna have to pack everything up and go home. It's over. Rest in peace, Dungeons and Dragons Golden Age 2024. Well, at least that's what Dungeons and Dragons buff, self-described Dungeons and Dragons historian, and author of the book Slaying the Dragon, A Secret History of Dungeons and Dragons, claimed very recently. And to say that this claim has been highly controversial is perhaps a little bit of an understatement. It has caused a lot of drama, a lot of pushback in the community. However, Ben is not the only person saying this. There's a huge group of people within the RPG hobby who agree with him. So what the hell is going on? Is Ben right? Is the golden age of Dungeons and Dragons over? And is it all the fault of those meddling kids? That is to say, Matt Mercer, Matt Colville, and basically every other third-party content creator for Dungeons and Dragons. Not just the ones called Matt. I'm sure there's a Tim in there somewhere. So Ben Riggs had this to say, quote, "The doom of our time approaches." Okay then, and the reason he gives for this doom is the OGL scandal, saying, quote, "In the wake of the open gaming license scandal, a number of companies successfully launched new RPGs intended to move past the possibility of Wizards of the Coast threatening their business ever again. Some have grossed millions in crowdfunding campaigns. All have been positively reviewed. Some cite the success of these games as signs of the continued health and growth of the TTRPG industry. They are not. Rather, they are signs that the industry has peaked and may about to enter a decline." Okay, so there is a lot going on here. If you don't know, this time last year, Hasbro Wizards, the developers of Dungeons and Dragons, tried to bully a lot of third-party creators into signing a draconian gaming license that gave Hasbro Wizards control over those third-party content. This was the infamous OGL scandal, and it upset a delicate ecosystem and culture that had formed around Dungeons and Dragons over the last 20 years. And while Hasbro Wizards did eventually back off from their insane demands in the face of pushback by RPG fans, unfortunately it was too little too late for many creators, and many of them have since moved on to create their own games. For example, Critical Role are moving on to Daggerheart and Candela Obscura. Matt Colville and MCDM are moving on to the MCDM game. Is that really the name? And Colville Press have a new RPG coming out called Tales of the Valiant, etc, etc. Third-party creators are generally just moving away and creating their own games and their own spaces separate from Dungeons and Dragons. And they've been massively successful in doing so, generating a lot of money and a lot of excitement. MCDM recently just made headlines with their millions of dollars achieved in crowdfunding. But according to Ben, this is really bad because, quote, "5th edition Dungeons & Dragons was not just a game, but a massive community of players. Countless companies could thrive making products for that community. These new games are a shattering of that community." So Ben is claiming here that a successful, strong Dungeons and Dragons is good for everyone, for all the entire RPG industry, because it leads to more money in RPGs generally, and it creates an environment that is easier for creatives to break into. In his words, a rising tide, read Dungeons and Dragons, raises all boats, read all other RPGs, and that this is the true source of the golden age of role-playing games. games. But he goes on to say that this is all over because all those third parties are moving on to their own games, the selfish jerks. And it's this claim that has caused a huge stir in the community and led to a lot of drama, a lot of discourse, a lot of conversations. But here's the thing, Ben, the Dungeons and Dragons historian, is not alone. There's a major demographic of people who agree with him. So I think that we need to talk about this because there's a lot to unpack here. And even I must admit that I agree with Ben on some points. Namely, that Dungeons and Dragons has been seen for the longest time as the default RPG, and Hasbro Wizards do have a captive population of consumers that will buy a lot of Dungeons and Dragons content. However, I disagree with his argument that this is particularly good for everyone. You see, a central plank of Ben and many others' argument is that people come into role-playing games specifically for Dungeons and Dragons and then eventually filter out into the wider RPG marketplace and try other games. But here's the thing, even if Dungeons and Dragons were discontinued tomorrow, I don't think that would change. Dungeons and Dragons is very popular right now, but that's really because of reasons outside of Hasbro Wizards' control. They just kind of stumbled into this thing. And it was partially the work of creators like Critical Role and Matt Colville who popularized D&D, but really the resurgence of the game is mostly because pop culture has experienced a massive shift towards nerd nostalgia generally, and this has kind of dragged Dungeons and Dragons along with it. Really, Dungeons and Dragons has already done all that it can for the RPG hobby by being a recognizable phenomenon that people fondly remember from the pre-internet days. As a result, it now gets referenced a lot on TV and in pop culture. It losing its market dominance of the RPG hobby tomorrow, which is what Ben speculates, that wouldn't change D&D's role in pop culture, and people would still filter into RPGs generally. Dungeons and Dragons is a cultural touchstone. That ain't changing anytime soon. And my evidence that I'd like to present for this is me, myself. I'm living proof of this. The first Dungeons and Dragons that I ever played wasn't Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, I thought it was, but it wasn't. It was Pathfinder, and I didn't know any better, but it was basically the same thing that I had watched Dexter do in that Dexter's Laboratory episode as a kid, so I was pretty much satisfied. I played Pathfinder, and I had fun. And then I learned later on that it wasn't really Dungeons and Dragons, but I didn't really care. By that stage, my love of RPGs had been awakened. I went on to play Call of Cthulhu, GURPS, World of Darkness, and more. And the same would be true of new RPG folk if Dungeons and Dragons were to collapse tomorrow and everyone moved over to the new MCDM game. New folk would just play that game instead, and the hobby would be fine. The only real change would be when you type in the sentence, "I want to play D&D" into Google, you'd be sent to the MCDM subreddit instead of the D&D one. And also, as an aside, I don't think that just because they now have competing RPGs that Matt Colville or Matt Mercer or any content creator will stop making content that will always be useful to Dungeons and Dragons fans anyway. Honestly, most of their content and advice was already pretty generic. Not in a bad way, I'm not saying that it's dull or anything, I'm just saying that the advice that they give can be used for most action-adventure, heroic combat RPGs. Their content is all about pacing and good storytelling and world building. This is useful for most RPGs. Whether most people are playing Pathfinder, Daggerheart, or D&D, I just don't see that changing. And it can lead to really interesting content. Look at Seth Skarkowski's channel for a great example of that. And he doesn't play D&D at all. Of course, this is all presupposing a pretty major assumption though, that most people get into Dungeons and Dragons and then filter out into the wider RPG space. I mean, if that's not true, then Ben's entire argument kind of falls apart. And I'm gonna be honest, I'm not 100% convinced that that happens very often. As someone who has run a large community of primarily Dungeons and Dragons players and tried to get them to play another game, let me tell you, it's hard, man. I found that most people who play other RPGs got there through Dungeons and Dragons, sure, but a lot of people who play Dungeons and Dragons just don't necessarily play other RPGs. RPGs. However, once someone does try a different game, it is so much easier to get them to try even more other games. It's like you break the seal and it opens up a whole new world to them, like your first gay experience. So my personal playgroup plays a lot of games. Yes, we play Dungeons and Dragons, but we also play Call of Cthulhu, World of Darkness, Warhammer RPG, Dark Heresy. In fact, in the last year alone, I've played games in GURPS, Call of Cthulhu, Pendragon, Thirsty Sword Lesbians, Pathfinder, Dungeons and Dragons, Borg, Cyborg, RuneQuest, Delta Green, Mothership, and more that I've probably forgotten. Look, we play a lot of one-shots. And part of the reason for that is that no one in my game group identifies as a Dungeons and Dragons player. We're just RPG sluts. We'll play any game. And most of us didn't get into RPGs through Dungeons and Dragons. We got in with like World of Darkness and Dark Heresy. In my experience, once people shed their identity as a Dungeons and Dragons player and embrace the RPG slut label, everything changes. I mean, that might sound like a subtle shift, but it's actually quite seismic. And for that reason, I'm really thankful that creators like Matt Colville and Matt Mercer and others are going off to create their own games, ones that are actually targeted at getting Dungeons and Dragons players to try other systems. Because without them, Dungeons and Dragons could get a monopoly on RPGs, and I don't think that's good. See, I am engaged in hobbies that are totally dominated by a single brand, even more so than D&D and role-playing games. I bet you've heard of Warhammer, for example, but did you know that Warhammer is actually just one game in a huge, expansive wargaming hobby that includes tons of really fun war games, many of which improve on a lot of the mechanics of Warhammer and also have really cool settings, many of which rival Warhammer for depth and badass factor. Well, most people don't, because the wargame hobby is cemented around Warhammer. Warhammer is the biggest brand, and it has grown to essentially monopolize the wargaming hobby. In fact, most people who play war games call it the Warhammer hobby, not the wargame hobby, and they describe themselves as Warhammer hobbyists, not wargamers. So intense is Games Workshop's stranglehold over the hobby space of wargaming. Compare that to video games though, I mean, that is a hobby that has a huge variety of games. No one company owns the intellectual pie. No one describes themselves as a Fleshlight Squad hobbyist. That would just be sort of weird. I mean, they just call themselves gamers. And as a result, even though video games have a lot of problems, they really do, they don't have a monopoly issue because there's just no one game that has taken over the complete space and strangled out all the others like the tentacle monster boss in Fleshlight Squad. To be frank, I think that the D&D space breaking up into multiple systems is a cultural shift, and it is a totally welcome one. I mean, sure, it suits big corporations to solidify hobbies under a single brand because they can make more money that way. But ultimately, what we end up with as hobbyists is less choice, we end up with less games, and we end up with a hobby that is vulnerable to big scandals like the OGL scandal. It's just an evolutionary dead end. All our eggs end up in one basket, and that might make it easier to find eggs, but if someone sits down in the wrong place, then all the eggs break. And if all the eggs break, then there's no more eggs. You've got no eggs anymore. And that's no yoke. Better to spread out the risk, deposit the eggs in many spaces, and enjoy a variety of experiences. Instead of many people playing one game, many people will play many games. And so what Ben laments as the breakup and balkanization of the RPG hobby because of Matt Colville and Matt Mercer and others, I would simply call that the diversification of the hobby. And that's actually a lot healthier for the hobby as a whole and should be preferable to everyone, you know, unless you're like Hasbro Wizards. I mean, it's pretty bad for them. Yeah, they'll have competition now. Oops. This larger variety of games, I think that could actually lead to even more money in RPGs generally in the future, because more different games means more entry points for more people to the RPG hobby, just like the first boss in Fleshlight Squad. For example, here we have Dave, Sarah, Pete, and Impelio, Destroyer of Worlds. Dave and Sarah love exploring dungeons and killing monsters. Pete and Impelio, Destroyer of Worlds do not. In a world where most people play Dungeons and Dragons, Pete and Impelio, Destroyer of Worlds won't engage with role-playing games. I mean, sure, they might like making characters, they love doing the voices and role-playing, but going into dungeons, banging goblins? Boring. However, switch to a world where most people just play role-playing games, not Dungeons and Dragons, but role-playing games, then when Pete and Impelio, Destroyer of Worlds, come over to Dave's house and Dave asks if they want to play an RPG, they don't say, "No thanks, I don't want to bang a goblin." They can instead say, "Hey, what's that game on your shelf about wrangling snakes on Jupiter?" And Dave can say, "That's Space Snake, wanna play?" And they say, "Hell yeah!" And then everybody wrangles some snakes and have a blast. Sounds like a pretty sick game, actually. In other words, a variety of games being popular means that it will appeal to a larger variety of gamers, and a larger variety of gamers means that there's an overall bigger potential market out there and more money for the RPG industry. And this isn't me just like speculating, this is demonstrably true. In Japan, for example, Dungeons and Dragons isn't popular, but Call of Cthulhu is massive, especially amongst older women. So why the hell aren't we hitting the older women demographic in Dungeons and Dragons? Come on, there's money to be made here, people. If you asked my dad to play Dungeons and Dragons, first of all, I mean, that would be kind of weird, but he wouldn't be interested. However, if you asked him to play Armalite and Ballot Box, and suddenly he might be a lot more enthusiastic. So it just doesn't matter if the RPG hobby splits out into multiple different brands and all the publishers end up getting a smaller slice of the pie, if that pie is bigger than before. I mean, I'd rather have one slice of a 12-inch pizza than 5 slices of a 1-inch pizza. And that's what all of these new RPGs have the potential to do, to grow our pizza so it's even bigger. So I don't think that D&D losing its dominance of the RPG hobby is necessarily bad. However, Ben does give evidence for the idea that the hobby could potentially get smaller when Dungeons and Dragons doesn't have a monopoly anymore. And the evidence that he gives for this is the go-go 90s, baby. So in Ben's argument, he describes how in the 90s, TSR, the old developers of Dungeons and Dragons, used to publish a lot of different setting books for Dungeons and Dragons, but no one would buy them, and then TSR kind of went bankrupt. It was a whole thing. And he extrapolates that because no one was interested in buying Dungeons and Dragons setting books in the 90s, that they just wouldn't be interested in buying a wide variety of RPGs in the modern day. And my bookshelf really disagrees with you, Ben. I really firmly disagree with this argument. So leaving aside the fact that different D&D settings are like not different RPGs, and I don't think you can compare the two, I think that he's leaving quite a bit of context out that explains why RPGs just weren't big back then. And it's not because Dungeons and Dragons didn't have a monopoly. The real problem for RPGs in the 90s was that there just wasn't a cultural zeitgeist of nerddom. The 90s were the age of the incredibly embarrassing PlayStation 1 ad. Back in those days, when you told people that you played Dungeons and Dragons, they'd take your lunch money and stuff you in a locker. Of course, RPGs would suffer in that context, but that context has changed. It's now socially acceptable to be a nerd. Hell, it's normal to be a nerd. The non-nerds are now nerds, and the nerds are non-nerds. These days, you're a weirdo if you don't know who Captain America is. Take that one, jocks. They really lost the war on that fight. Probably because of all the head injuries. And to be frank, the only thing that will hurt RPGs is if being into nerd stuff stops being cool. But I mean, get a load of this guy. This will be cool forever. So no, I don't think that the golden age of Dungeons and Dragons or RPGs is over. And I don't think that Matt Mercer and Matt Colville were the ones that killed the golden age. I think if anything, they're bringing in a new golden age. I think this thing is just getting started, baby. I mean, don't believe me? Well, I mean, check out all these different games and tell me I'm wrong. And a huge thanks to my patrons, especially CryptoKev, Novany, and Travis Hunter. If you want to support this channel, please do check out my Patreon or simply just subscribe to the channel, and I'll catch y'all next time. Bye-bye!